Minneapolis, January 7th, 2026. Let's picture the scene. It's about 9:40 in the morning in the middle of a residential neighborhood in South Minneapolis. We're talking 34th Street and Portland Avenue.
And you have to understand, the atmosphere in the Twin Cities for weeks, maybe months leading up to this
Yeah.
was, well, it was incredibly tense.
Right. Federal immigration enforcement operations had been seriously ramped up and, local opposition was mobilized and very vocal.
It was a highly, highly charged environment. And then in probably less than a minute, everything just exploded.
Yeah.
You have this fatal confrontation between a federal ICE agent and a local woman, 37-year-old Renee Nicole Good.
And that one incident, that one moment, it just shatters any kind of order and launches two completely, and I mean completely polarized narratives into the public almost instantly.
Instantly. And they could not be more different from each other.
Not at all. On one side, you've got the federal establishment, that's the Department of Homeland Security, the DHS, and it's all backed by the Trump administration.
And their story is that Good was a violent agitator, and her actions constituted an act of domestic terrorism.
Their claim is really explicit. They say she weaponized her vehicle to try and kill an officer, and that officer then shot her in what they call self-defense.
But then you have the complete other side of the coin. You've got local city officials, state officials, a number of witnesses, and the community itself.
And their narrative.
Their narratives describes the agent's action as outright murder. They use the term state-sanctioned execution.
And they're not just saying it, they're disputing the self-defense claim with everything they have, right?
Vehemently. They often point to civilian video evidence that they say shows the agent was never in the kind of imminent danger that would justify using lethal force.
So our source material for this deep dive is defined by this conflict. It's this massive chasm that separates the facts, the motivations, the legal claims.
Yeah.
Our mission today is to try and unpack this informational deadlock. We're going to dissect the specific moment-by-moment accounts of the incident itself.
We're going to explore the contrasting personal histories of both the victim and the officer, which, turn out to be incredibly relevant here.
And then analyze that intense political reaction, the federal surge it triggered, and, crucially, look at the legal and jurisdictional battle that is now completely governing the investigation. So, let's unpack the details of this deeply fractured story.
I think we have to start by setting the exact physical stage. This was not just a routine traffic stop or something.
No.
This incident happened right in the middle of a large-scale ICE enforcement operation. So you have agents actively moving through a community, and residents are on high alert.
And the core of this confrontation, it involves Renee Nicole Good's vehicle. It's a red Honda Pilot registered in Missouri, which is an interesting detail since she was living in the Twin Cities.
Right. And her SUV is positioned against a group of federal agents who are driving a dark gray Nissan Titan truck. And the whole thing seems to start when Good's SUV appears to be blocking the path of the ICE vehicles on the street.
And this positioning, that's the very first point of contention, isn't it?
It is. Was she actively and intentionally obstructing their operation? Or was she simply there, caught in the wrong place?
We don't know for sure, but we do know what happened next. Reports confirm that masked agents got out of their truck.
And they approach her car pretty rapidly, repeatedly instructing her to get out of the car. And you have to imagine, that move right there, masked federal agents rushing your vehicle, it immediately raises the tension level to 100.
And the video evidence that's out there, it confirms this escalation. Good stays inside the vehicle.
Mm-hmm.
She reportedly tells the agents, who are, yelling at her to get out, something like, "Go around!"
So she's not complying with their commands.
Not at all. And then the confrontation goes from a verbal back and forth to a physical movement. She puts the car in motion.
And it's a very specific sequence of movements. She initially reverses the SUV, just a short distance, maybe a few feet. And then she shifts it into drive and moves forward.
And it is that brief forward movement, that little lurch, that the entire federal justification hangs on.
Everything. The central question becomes, did that forward movement constitute a willful weaponized assault on a federal officer?
And the federal side, they didn't waste a second defining it as exactly that.
No hesitation. DHS Assistant Secretary Tricia McLaughlin and then later Secretary Kristi Noem, they immediately came out and labeled the action an act of domestic terrorism.
The argument being that a vehicle, especially one that's being used to impede federal law enforcement, it becomes a lethal weapon in that context.
And President Trump himself echoed this rhetoric. He stated that Good was, quote, very disorderly, obstructing and resisting, before she violently, willfully, and viciously ran over the IC officer.
So they're painting a very clear picture of a direct, intentional attack.
A very clear picture. They assert that the agent, quote, fearing for his life, fired what they repeatedly termed defensive shots. I mean, the initial press releases from the federal government made it sound like a completely clear-cut case of an officer just preventing his own death.
And they supported that narrative with details about the officer's condition. They noted he was transported to a hospital, he was treated, and then he was later released.
The implication, of course, being that he was injured by the vehicle, that he was, in fact, struck.
But this is where that local, highly contradictory narrative just completely fractures the federal claim.
It shatters it. Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey, he publicly and very vehemently disputed the self-defense claim.
And he didn't just dispute them, he outright called the federal assertion, and I'm quoting him here, Walz.
Yeah. And you have to understand, this wasn't just political grandstanding from the mayor. He's citing alternative interpretations of the very same video evidence.
Right. According to some of the local news outlets that reviewed citizen-captured footage, one particular angle allegedly showed several feet of separation between the SUV and the agent at the moment he fired his weapon.
Which is a huge detail. Furthermore, that same local review of the video suggested the agent remained on his feet the whole time. He walked away, apparently uninjured, immediately after the shooting.
So that creates this massive informational deadlock. How can the federal government claim there was a near-fatal, vicious vehicular assault that put an agent in fear for his life?
Right.
If the video suggests that same agent was physically separated from the car by several feet and was able to just walk away right after.
It's the difference between being, lightly clipped by a slow-rolling car and being violently run over.
Yeah.
And a witness who spoke to FOX9 even contradicted the forward movement claim entirely, saying the vehicle wasn't moving toward the agents at all.
And if the vehicle wasn't moving toward the agents, then the justification for using lethal force, it just completely vanishes.
It evaporates. What we do know for sure is the tragic end result. The agent fired 3 shots into the driver's side of the car,
striking Renee Nicole Good in the head.
And the car, now without a driver, it sped past the agent and crashed into a lamppost and another parked vehicle a short distance down the road.
And maybe the absolute most critical missing piece of evidence in this whole reconstruction is the confirmed absence of any official documentation from the agents themselves. ICE sources confirm that none of the agents involved in the shooting were wearing body cameras.
And that absence is just catastrophic for clarity and for public trust. In a situation that immediately polarized the entire country, that body camera footage would have been the closest thing we could ever get to an objective record.
It would have given us crucial seconds of audio, of video, data on the agent's exact positioning, the car's speed, its trajectory, the commands that were given, all of it.
But because that footage just doesn't exist, the entire investigation now has to rely on, highly selective witness testimony, fragmented citizen video, which can be incredibly misleading depending on the angle.
Right.
And this competition between 2 powerful government entities, each pushing their own version of events. It makes achieving any public consensus on the basic sequence of events, virtually impossible.
And we also have to remember the broader context here. This was not a standalone incident in a vacuum.
Not at all.
These agents were part of a massive surge operation. DHS had sent roughly 2,000 federal agents to the Twin Cities that week, specifically to target immigrant populations.
So this was a high-stakes, extremely volatile environment where confrontation, resistance, fear, all of that was already running incredibly high on both sides.
And that context, it means the interaction was loaded with this pre-existing tension, turning what might have been a simple traffic block into an immediate flashpoint.
It was a tinderbox.
So we're left with this choice. Do you believe the federal assertion of a willful, vicious vehicular assault that was justified by an immediate threat? Or do you believe the local claim of a panicked woman trying to flee, resulting in an unjustified execution?
And since that physical evidence remains so hotly contested, both sides immediately pivoted. They started leveraging the personal histories of the people involved to support their claims.
Right. When physical evidence is inconclusive, character evidence becomes absolutely paramount.
Both the federal government and the local activists understood this instantly. They began leveraging the histories of Renee Nicole Good and the agent Jonathan Ross to reinforce their diametrically opposed claims of self-defense versus murder.
So let's start with Renee Nicole Good. On the surface, she was a 37-year-old U.S. citizen, a mother of 3. Her sort of conventional life story is that of an intellectually curious writer.
Right. She graduated from Old Dominion University back in 2020 with a degree in English with a specialization in creative writing. She often described herself as a poet.
And her mother, a woman named Donna Ganger, she painted a very compassionate picture of her.
She did. Ganger described her daughter as, quote, one of the kindest people I've ever known, extremely compassionate. And crucially, she denied that her daughter was involved in anti-IC protests.
So the mother's narrative is that she was just a bystander.
Exactly. Ganger insisted her daughter was likely just terrified in that moment of confrontation, implying it was a panic flight rather than any kind of intentional attack.
However, her public identity, at least according to local activists who knew her, suggests a much more intentional presence at that scene.
This is a critical distinction. Local residents who attended a vigil for her identified Good as a warrior who actively participated in something called an ICE Watch group.
And for those who don't know, what exactly are IC Watch groups?
Well, they're specifically organized for documentation and nonviolent resistance against immigration enforcement operations. They exist to monitor, to observe, and to document what agents are doing in the community.
So they're like watchdogs?
Essentially, yes. They often try to provide legal support or simply raise public awareness about enforcement actions happening in their neighborhoods.
And there were reports that she was trained for this, right?
Yes. One local resident gave some specific details about the group's training, noting that Good, quote, was trained against these ICE agents on what to do, what not to do.
Things like how to listen to commands, to know your rights.
Right, and even to whistle when you see an ICE agent to alert the community. And this view was further cemented when Democratic Representative Ilhan Omar referred to Good specifically as a legal observer.
Okay, so if Good was a trained ICI watch warrior or a legal observer, her presence at that intersection was almost certainly intentional.
It seems very likely. She wasn't just a bystander who happened to be driving by. She was probably there to document or to intervene in some capacity.
And this feeds both narratives, doesn't it? For the federal side, it proves she was actively obstructing and resisting a legitimate law enforcement operation.
But for the local narrative, it proves she was a community member lawfully exercising her rights, acting as a kind of nonviolent shield for her neighbors.
This dual profile, the compassionate poet versus the actively trained observer, it's the perfect foundation for political exploitation. But to really understand the immediate justification for the shooting, we have to turn to the officer, Agent Jonathan E. Ross.
Agent Ross was quickly identified. He is a Minnesota resident and a 10-year veteran of federal law enforcement. His profile, however, became exponentially more complex and more powerful for the federal defense because of something that happened just 7 months earlier.
And this is where we really need to spend some time, because this prior trauma is the absolute bedrock of the federal self-defense argument.
It's everything. Agent Ross was the same exact officer who, in June of 2025, was brutally dragged by a vehicle driven by an illegal immigrant sex offender named Roberto Carlos Munoz.
And this was during an attempted arrest in Bloomington, Minnesota, just a few miles away.
And the specifics of that June 2025 assault, they aren't just background noise. They are crucial context for trying to assess his state of mind in January 2026.
According to the court records from the prosecution of Munoz that followed, Ross had actually tried to de-escalate that situation before the assault.
He did. He had holstered his weapon. He issued clear commands in both English and Spanish for the suspect to put the car in park. He even warned the suspect about the consequences of resisting, that he would break the window.
But despite all of those efforts, the suspect, Munoz, he just put the car into drive and accelerated rapidly.
Violently. Ross's arm was caught, and he was dragged somewhere between 50 and 100 yards down the street. It was so intense that even being hit twice with a taser failed to stop Munoz. He was eventually captured and convicted, but the damage was done.
And the physical aftermath for Ross was severe.
Extremely. He was hospitalized. He required 33 stitches, 20 in his right arm, 13 in his left, along with multiple large cuts and really severe abrasions. This was not a minor scuffle. This was a near-lethal high-speed assault using a vehicle as a weapon.
So the implication for the Minneapolis shooting is massive. When Vice President J.D. Vance immediately stepped forward to defend Ross, he emphasized this history.
Right. He said the officer deserves a debt of gratitude, and pointed out that he has been attacked and injured by a vehicle before. The administration used this documented trauma, both physical and psychological, to validate Ross's fear.
And this gets into the legal weeds a bit, but there's a concept called the totality of the circumstances, which we'll get into more later.
Right. And it demands that an investigator look at the situation from the officer's perspective in that moment.
So if you're an officer and just 7 months ago you were almost killed by being dragged by a car, and now you see another vehicle moving toward you after ignoring your commands,
your perception of an imminent threat is going to be dramatically heightened. It fundamentally changes the question from a simple, factual inquiry like, was the car physically touching him, to a psychological one.
Did Agent Ross have a reasonable, even if it was a traumatized belief, that he was in immediate danger of death or serious bodily harm?
And the federal argument is that the trauma from the Munoz incident made his fear absolutely justified in the moment he saw Renee Nicole Good's Honda Pilot move forward.
So this historical context becomes arguably the single strongest counter-argument the federal side has against that local video interpretation, the one that shows several feet of separation.
Exactly. They are basically arguing that a non-injured officer walking away doesn't mean the threat wasn't imminent and lethal. It means the officer successfully neutralized the threat based on his reasonable, though possibly trauma-induced, perception of a lethal risk.
And then adding fuel to that perception, you have these statistics that DHS kept citing, which framed the entire operational environment as hostile and dangerous.
The numbers were staggering. They claimed a 1,300% increase in assaults against IC agents, a 3,200% surge in vehicle attacks, and an 8,000% increase in death threats against officers.
Now, whether those numbers are statistically sound or politically motivated is a whole other question.
It is. But they absolutely reflect the operational mindset that Agent Ross was working under. It creates this narrative collision of profound complexity.
On one side, a woman with this dual profile of activist and poet.
And on the other, an officer whose professional identity had just been violently redefined by a near-death vehicular attack a few months earlier. This tragic intersection set the stage for immediate and incredibly intense political polarization.
The moment that agent's gun fired, the incident, it just transcended being a local law enforcement action. It instantly became a national political flashpoint.
Well, particularly because it involved the Trump administration's really aggressive immigration enforcement goals, clashing so directly with the progressive leadership of Minneapolis and the state of Minnesota.
And the federal response, which was spearheaded by DHS Secretary Kristi Noem, was, well, it was swift. And it was unyielding.
She didn't just defend Agent Ross. She used the tragedy to justify a massive policy escalation. She explicitly cited that previous ramming incident and argued the shooting was entirely preventable.
Her argument being that if Renee Nicole Good had simply complied and not attempted to, quote, weaponize her vehicle, she would still be alive.
Precisely. And this rhetorical strategy, it was aimed at transforming what was a potentially messy police shooting into a clear-cut victory against domestic terrorism.
And that's when she deployed those astounding statistics we just mentioned. The 1,300% increase in assaults, the 200% surge in vehicle attacks.
She used those numbers to frame this single shooting not as an isolated tragedy, but as part of a widespread, escalating, and even coordinated war being waged against federal agents.
And she even made some highly specific and, it should be said, locally disputed claims about that day.
She did. She alleged that on the day of the shooting alone, there were 4 different domestic terrorist attacks on federal officers involving vehicle ramming, and that 3 of them occurred within Minneapolis.
The political goal there seems crystal clear. Establish a baseline of chaos and violence to make the agent's response appear necessary and defensive.
And the response wasn't just words. The federal government immediately signaled its intent to escalate enforcement on the ground.
Right. DHS deployed more than 100 additional U.S. Customs and Border Protection, or CBP, agents and officers to Minnesota to continue ICE operations.
And this was on top of that surge of about 2,000 federal agents that had already been sent to the Twin Cities that week to target immigrant populations.
This deployment, it felt like a punitive message.
It was. Resistance will be met not with withdrawal, but with an intensified federal presence. It was a clear power move, demonstrating that the federal mission was going to proceed, regardless of local pushback or community sentiment.
And that strong federal escalation was met with an equally intense and local and state opposition.
Oh, yeah. Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey's response was just one of sheer outrage. He demanded that ICE to get the feck out of Minneapolis.
He argued that the federal presence was the thing explicitly causing the chaos, and that it was terrorizing residents.
His argument was that this tragedy was a direct consequence of federal overreach. People are being hurt, families are being ripped apart, and now a U.S. citizen is dead. And he placed the responsibility for that death squarely with the federal agency for its aggressive actions in his city.
And the state leaders, they backed him up pretty quickly.
They did. Governor Tim Walz condemned the shooting and then took a really critical step by mobilizing units of the State National Guard to be at the ready.
He also activated the State Emergency Operations Center, right?
Yes, in case the protests, which were already erupting, descend into further chaos. And Walz explicitly challenged the federal narrative. He told the people of Minnesota not to believe the DHS's propaganda machine.
Mobilizing the National Guard, I mean, that is a serious escalation of state readiness.
It's a huge step. It suggests the state government was actively preparing for potential civil unrest or, and this is maybe more telling, anticipating a continued antagonistic relationship with the federal agents operating within its own borders.
And the condemnation from national Democrats was just as forceful.
Yeah, Democratic Representative Jasmine Crockett from Texas called the shooting a state-sanctioned execution. She warned that protests would erupt nationwide until the officer was prosecuted.
And she directly challenged that concept of federal immunity, right? She questioned whether officers are above the law just because they have a badge.
Absolutely. And this political friction, it just spilled immediately onto the streets. Anti-IC protests erupted at the scene, 34th and Portland, almost instantly.
And law enforcement deployed significant crowd control measures. We're talking tear gas, chemical irritants to manage the crowds, which just highlights how volatile the community reaction was.
But the tension wasn't just limited to the protest site. We also have that deeply, deeply troubling incident that happened at Roosevelt High School.
Minneapolis public schools actually canceled classes district-wide the next day because of safety concerns stemming from this confrontation.
School officials reported that armed Border Patrol officers, who were part of that surging federal presence, came onto school property during student dismissal.
The reports from the school were alarming. The agents allegedly tackled people. They handcuffed 2 school staff members and deployed chemical agents against bystanders.
The use of force and chemical agents on school grounds during the time when children were being dismissed, it just dramatically inflamed community outrage.
And it validated the local claim that the federal presence was causing chaos and terrorizing the population.
A school official described the officers as behaving like animals and emphasized that school property should be treated as a protected zone, a safe space.
So this incident, it provided this strong, visible, local evidence for the narrative that the federal agents were acting with aggressive impunity.
And it further solidified the local government's refusal to cooperate with DHS.
So on one side, you have the federal government justifying lethal force with statistical claims of rising attacks and declaring the victim a domestic terrorist.
And on the other, you have state and local leaders demanding federal agents leave, calling the act murder, and activating the National Guard.
Which brings us to the core issue here. Given this level of political friction and this informational deadlock, who actually holds the authority to investigate this highly charged incident?
And that's where this situation just immediately exposed the extreme fragility of federal-state cooperation, leading to an immediate and, frankly, unprecedented jurisdictional battle.
Initially, the setup was pretty standard for a case like this, right?
It was. The shooting was going to be investigated jointly by the FBI and the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, which is known as the BCA.
And for anyone unfamiliar, the BCA is the state agency in Minnesota that's primarily responsible for investigating serious criminal incidents that involve law enforcement. It's supposed to ensure a level of local accountability.
Supposed to, yes. However, federal officials reversed course within just hours of the incident.
The FBI took sole control of the investigation, and the implications of that action were immediate and devastating to the state's ability to conduct any kind of oversight.
They completely revoked the BCA's access to all case materials, to witnesses, and to evidence. This meant the state agency, specifically designed for police accountability, was entirely locked out of the process.
And DHS Secretary Noem, she defended this unilateral takeover.
She did. She claimed definitively that the BCA, quote, don't have any jurisdiction in this investigation, full stop.
And Governor Walz and Attorney General Keith Ellison, they pushed back fiercely.
As you'd expect. They insisted that regardless of the officer's federal status, quote, Minnesota must be part of this investigation.
Their argument was that a fair outcome was impossible, given that federal officials, including the President of the United States, had already passed judgment by labeling the victim a domestic terrorist from the get-go.
And the Public Safety Commissioner, Bob Jacobson, He laid out the practical reality of the situation. He said that conducting an independent state investigation without federal cooperation is extremely difficult, if not impossible.
So the lack of federal evidence sharing, it just starves the state investigation of the necessary raw data.
It does. They have no access to witness lists, forensic reports, the officer's official statement. It makes any meaningful, independent state review nearly impossible. The state is essentially being forced to rely only on citizen evidence, while the federal government controls the entire official record.
This strategic withholding of evidence, it leads us directly into the massive legal hurdle that the state is facing, this question of federal immunity and the difficulty of a state prosecution.
Right. Hennepin County Attorney Mary Moriarty and A.G. Ellison, they're actively exploring options for state murder or manslaughter charges against Agent Ross.
But the federal defense is incredibly robust, and it's centered on this doctrine of sovereign immunity.
Vice President Vance stated it outright. He said the agent is protected by absolute immunity, and he reiterated he was doing his job. This is the core legal mechanism the federal government uses to shield its employees.
So just to clarify this key legal concept for our listeners, if state charges are brought against a federal officer, say, for murder, what happens?
The federal government has the immediate right to remove the case from state court and move it into the federal judicial system.
Okay. And once the case is moved to federal court, it faces a pretty rigorous legal test, right? Something called the scope of employment doctrine.
Exactly. And former federal prosecutors confirmed that the case would very likely be dismissed unless the state could prove that the agent acted outside the scope of his official duties.
And proving that is an incredibly high bar to clear.
An almost impossibly high bar. If Agent Ross was performing an authorized ICE operation, and if he claims he fired in self-defense to prevent a vehicular assault, which is part of his job training, a federal judge is highly likely to rule that, even if the force was excessive, it still occurred within the scope of his official duties.
And the result of that ruling is dismissal.
Dismissal, which effectively grants the agent immunity from any state prosecution. The only way around it would be if the state could prove, for example, that the agent was on a personal errand, or that the use of force was so egregious, so far outside the bounds of any recognizable law enforcement protocol, that it was a purely personal criminal act.
And given the official DHS defense of his actions as defensive shots, the state's path seems almost certainly blocked.
It's a very narrow path. Ultimately, the success or failure of any prosecution, whether it's state or federal, it's going to hinge entirely on whether the use of deadly force met the constitutional standard.
This is the Fourth Amendment standard, which governs seizures, specifically the Supreme Court guidance regarding the use of lethal force.
And the crucial test, as established by Supreme Court precedent, is the totality of the circumstances.
Which means investigators are mandated to look at the situation objectively, considering everything.
Everything. The threat that was perceived, the speed of the events, the actions of the officer, and the actions of the suspect before, during, and after the vehicle's movement.
And the rule itself is clear. Deadly force is legally considered a last resort.
It's only justified when the officer has a reasonable belief that it's necessary to preserve their own life, or the lives of others, or to prevent serious bodily injury.
Which brings us right back to the most critical factual dispute in this entire case. Was Renee Nicole Good attempting to strike the officer, or was she simply attempting to flee?
And that distinction is absolutely paramount in Fourth Amendment law.
Because lethal force is typically not permitted against a fleeing subject who poses no immediate threat to the officer or to the public.
So if the investigation concludes she was only trying to drive away and was not an imminent lethal threat, then the constitutional standard is violated and the shooting is unjustified.
However, if the agent genuinely perceived the car's movement as an attempt to ram and kill him, especially given his documented history of a near-fatal vehicular assault,
then the shooting could be justified under that preserve life standard, even if his perception was slightly exaggerated due to trauma.
And this leads to a fascinating tactical and legal point that was raised by some former federal prosecutors. Officers are strongly advised not to place themselves in the path of a moving vehicle.
And that tactical advice has real constitutional consequences. When an officer voluntarily positions themselves in front of a vehicle, they can be seen as having unnecessarily elevated the danger.
Essentially creating a situation where lethal force becomes the only way out.
Exactly. Now, this doesn't automatically negate a self-defense claim, but it does factor into the totality of circumstances. Did the officer unnecessarily escalate the risk, making the use of deadly force the unavoidable consequence of his own tactical decision?
And that line of questioning will be central to whether the shooting is ultimately deemed constitutional or not, especially since the video evidence suggests he was able to walk away immediately.
So you have this tragic scene being interpreted through the lens of extreme trauma, a legal standard that prioritizes the officer's reasonable belief, and a massive jurisdictional fight where the state is effectively starved of the evidence it needs to challenge the federal narrative.
The entire resolution, the question of murder versus self-defense, of state prosecution versus federal immunity, it all hangs on the legal interpretation of just a few seconds of movement near a stationary vehicle.
It's an informational deadlock wrapped in a political and legal jurisdictional fight. And it's all taking place in a city that's already grappling with intense historical tensions around law enforcement and accountability.
And the lack of that body camera footage means we may never achieve a fully objective truth.
It forces the public to choose between a politically charged defense of an officer and a politically charged demand for justice for a deceased community member.
So this deep dive has really shown us a situation where the facts are hopelessly fractured by perception and by political agenda. The federal narrative portrays a dedicated officer thwarting an act of domestic terrorism by an organized agitator.
And they cite statistical proof of rising threats and the officer's recent severe trauma as complete justification.
And then the local narrative portrays a compassionate observer murdered by a federal agent who was acting with impunity.
And they cite video evidence that contradicts the imminent threat claim and the swift federal effort to block any state-level investigation.
Ultimately, the resolution of this case is going to be less about finding a universally accepted truth,
and more about which government entity, federal or state, successfully asserts its authority, and which legal standard absolute immunity or the Fourth Amendment's limit on lethal force prevails in court.
We discussed the legal standard for deadly force, that totality of the circumstances, and the ICE agent's immediate and documented history of being rammed and severely injured by a vehicle, resulting in severe psychological and physical trauma. Given the DHS claims of a massive surge in vehicle attacks against agents, this raises a really profound question for you to think about. How must law enforcement training and operational protocols adapt to address the psychological impact of prior trauma and rising threat levels? You know, that feeling that every car could be a weapon.
And how do they do that while strictly adhering to the constitutional limits on using lethal force against a moving vehicle?
Can law enforcement truly function within constitutional constraints when the officers themselves are operating with severe documented trauma, making every perceived threat a potentially lethal one? That's something for you to consider as this highly charged situation unfolds.